What's up, everybody? Welcome back to your latest installment of the Nuclear Barbarians podcast. And it is I, your nuclear barbarian, Emmett, and I am here to talk to the author, William D. Cohan, about his new book, Power Failure: The Rise and Fall of an American Icon, which is an incredible history of General Electric. It is a piece of industrial history that I think we should all take much greater note of. William, how are you? And thanks for joining us.
Hey, it's great to be here, Emmett. Thank you for having me.
So before we get into the book, I wanted to ask you a little bit sort of about yourself. You worked for GE for a time, you mentioned in I think in the acknowledgments towards the end of the book, and you've written several other books, many of them of comparable length. By the way, guys, this is a doorstopper and it's worth every page, especially for the Jack Welch quotes, which are like uniformly hilarious throughout. Um, Tell me a little bit about this story arc, how you got to be the guy that writes the history of GE.
Uh, well, the short version is I had been a journalist, and then after a couple of years, went back to get my MBA at Columbia, and then went to Wall Street. And my first job out of Columbia was at GE Capital, and this was in 1987. And my job was to finance leverage buyouts, which I was uniquely unqualified for, having been a journalist who then I was a journalist covering public education in Wake County, North Carolina,
Hmm.
and so through the alchemy of an MBA program, next thing you know, you sit there and you take these classes for 2 years. The next thing you know, you're hired to finance leverage buyouts at GE. So that was quite an unusual experience. And I did that for a year and then worked for the chief credit officer at GE Capital up in Stanford, reverse commuting between New York City and Stanford. And that during that year, I got to learn all of the businesses of GE Capital because they had to
Hmm.
come through the chief credit officer to get approved. So I was his analyst, and so I did the research, the work, the analysis to figure out whether GE Capital should actually finance these deals. And so first, I got this education about finance and leverage buyouts, and then I got this education about all the things that GE Capital did. So, then I spent another 15 plus years on Wall Street as a M&A investment banker, and then in 2004, almost 20 years ago, turned to writing. This is my seventh book, and uh, basically a strange piece of serendipity happened. Obviously, I knew plenty about GE and followed it and knew what an incredible company it was for the longest time. And one of the guys who I started with at GE Capital, financing leverage buyouts, this guy named John Flannery, uh, stayed at GE. I left, I went to Lazard, I went to Merrill Lynch, I went to JP Morgan Chase. He stayed, and lo and behold, in 2017, he was chosen to succeed Jeff Immelt as CEO
Hmm.
after Jeff Immelt got fired. So next thing I know is my good friend is CEO, which was great for him. But then I sort of started hearing and seeing and reading all the crazy things that were happening to GE and to him once he became CEO, uncovering problems in the power business, uncovering problems in the long-term healthcare companies that GE owned that he didn't even know they owned.
Hmm.
And after 15 months, he got fired in a coup, which I hadn't fully appreciated. And which was incredible because Jack Welch had been CEO for 20 years and Jeff Immelt had been CEO for 17 years, and here this great guy, John Flannery, my friend, lasts only 15 months. So, needless to say, there was sort of a dead body on the ground, and I had to
Mm,
figure out how it got there. So that's how it all came about.
that's
And then when
fascinating.
Jack Welch said he would, grant me interviews, as he was in declining health, well, that of course sealed the deal.
Oh, of course. Yeah. I mean, the opening's fantastic when you meet him at the golf course, and you ask him about Jeff Immelt, and the first thing he says, "Yeah, I fucked up." um,
That's
and which is
right.
true, which just seems true to form. I around when his book came out, from the
Hmm.
gut, and that's
Straight
a
from the
whole
gut.
straight from the gut. Yeah, that's a whole story arc. My mom actually, I think, interviewed him for like at a Cranes
Hmm.
event in Chicago, and she
Okay,
said that he was
that's right.
exactly like everybody said he was. Um, and but what I realized while reading it, he's this titanic figure. My mom's a small business owner. My stepfather ran a polyurethane manufactory, and I realized that he loomed so large in their lives, just as
Mm.
people interested in business. And then I realized that my generation, the millennials, might be the last generation, except for people who are dedicated to business and business history, who really know who Jack Welch was. He was like this almost statesman like figure that GE had produced. So I have some younger fans from the pro nuclear world, and I was wondering if you wouldn't tell us a little about who Jack Welch is, and how he came to be this prominent guy. Because I don't think he's a household name for the generation just below me.
Right, which of course you're right in being amazed at, because once upon a time, Jack Welch was it. I mean, he
Yeah.
was, uh, you know, Fortune dubbed him the manager of the century,
Mm-hmm.
the 20th century. And here we are, 23 years into the next century, and basically he seems to be fading, or his legacy is being revised. And what I well, I mean, let's just on who Jack was. I mean, he was you know only child of very much sort of lower middle class parents. Grew up north west of Boston in a town called Salem, Massachusetts, famous for the witch trials
Mm-hmm.
in the 1600s. Sort of a historic community. His father was worked on the train that went between Boston and the North Shore of Massachusetts, a train that I used to take all the time. I grew up near Salem too, so I'm very familiar with Salem. And he made his way to the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Mass, and then the University of Illinois, where he got his PhD in uh, like nuclear condensation,
Yeah, something
properties.
like.
I've looked at the PhD thesis, but I must say I don't understand it, much of it. And he they sort of wanted him to stay and be a professor. He was tempted by that, but of course he didn't want to be a professor. He wanted to go into business. He got offered a job at Exxon, and decided to take a job at GE in the plastics division, which was based in Pittsfield, Mass. Uh, and it was really totally because they like paid him $1,000 more or something a year,
Yeah.
and it was a completely nascent business. They had developed these this plastic. It wasn't even a product. They had this plastic material, and it was Jack's job to commercialize it,
Mm-hmm.
and he did that very effectively. That they became these plastic pellets that would be melted down and go into car bumpers and all sorts of car parts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he became a fantastic success doing that, sort of like a rocket ship at GE. But he was always um, growing up, he was a small guy, but he was a fierce sort of competitor.
and was also miraculously some sort of athlete. And he was, that he brought that competitive spirit. And he grew up, he stuttered, and he overcame his stutter. Again, another accomplishment, both on the athletic accomplishments, physical stuttering accomplishments. He wasn't a great student, but again, he got a PhD. And he just sort of lit it up at GE and would get really pissed off when he wasn't rewarded with the highest compensation. Like after his first year at GE Plastics, I think he was paid like $10,500 or something,
Hmm.
and he discovered that everybody in his group who had started when he did was getting paid $10,500 or whatever it was, and he got really pissed off because he thought he should have gotten paid more because he was smarter, better, faster, etc. And that he actually went in to quit. He also didn't like his boss. He went in to quit. He did quit, and he had like was getting ready to take another job in Chicago at some company,
Hmm.
and basically his boss's boss uh, talked him out of it, got him to stay, paid him more, and became his rabbi, and he decided to stay. So basically, Jack was raring to go. There was even a going away party for him where they gave him gifts that he took, even though he
Yeah,
decided to
he was
stay.
like, well, he was like, why would I do not do that? I mean,
Yeah,
here's the other thing that I found so interesting about him in your telling of how this guy rises to prominence. He just has this he sees things other people don't, and he sees things about people that other people don't, both their motives, their character. He can also sort of, it seems like he has this uncanny ability to sort of sort out bullshit and recognize the value in a situation. And I think one of my favorite stories of him like sorting out bullshit was, it's like right after he becomes CEO, and the appliance guys come to show him some refrigerators, and he's like, "What the fuck are you doing showing me this fridge? I haven't been in a fridge in like a decade." He's like, "I know what you're doing. I know what you're doing. This is so that if I say I like it because it's the color purple and it doesn't sell, you can say, well, you like the color purple." He's like, "Well, I'm not gonna fucking say it." And he said it almost just like that. And I was like, man, this guy knew what the drop was the second he walked in the room. And the thing was, is he could say things like that and people would still love him. Like he had this ability to be like, he wanted the fight, but that was also how he would establish intimacy with some of these guys. And they would cultivate these friendships and these
and to
like,
motivate them.
yeah, and to motivate them. Like he really wanted that out of his employees. I think he thought friction was the way forward, from what I can tell in your book.
Well, a combination of friction, challenging, and love. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah, he loved them deeply. Yeah.
and they loved him. I mean, one thing that really uh, shocked me as I reported this and interviewed all these people for the book is that even the people he fired, he they loved him. Like Dave Cody, who was running the major appliance division after doing a bunch of other things, which was based in Louisville, Kentucky, where they had those refrigerators and washing machines, etc. Since sold to the Chinese, by the way.
Mhm.
uh, but it's still sold under the GE brand for the time being. Anyway, that was sort of like the worst performing of the 13 GE divisions at that time. And basically, Jack, who liked Dave Cody quite a bit, called him up to, Fairfield, and they had dinner. They basically told Dave that, he had to leave the company because he was not going to be under consideration to be CEO after
Mhm.
Jack, and therefore he just had to leave. And Jack would not listen. Dave tried to, you know, talk to him about what he could do to change, to improve, to do better, to, give me another chance. He's like sort of pleading for his life, and Jack just wouldn't listen. Jack just
No.
said, "Please, you're out of here." And of course, Dave had to leave. Eventually worked at other places. Eventually became the CEO of Honeywell, which is another GE story, but
Yeah.
eventually,
Boy, is it.
and boy, is it. But eventually, even though Jack could have bought Honeywell, he decided not to, and then Honeywell remained and remains a publicly traded company, and it was ended up being worth more than GE. So I asked him, Jack, did he kind of make a mistake by firing Dave Cody? And he did admit that he did make a mistake. But Dave Cody, who was fired by Jack, still loves the guy. Was a
Yeah.
pallbearer at his funeral.
Yeah, there was a journalist who was doing like muckraking on GE, and like Welch basically just hammers the guy, and he ends up leaving journalism and all this stuff. And he's like, well, at the end of the day, I have to thank Jack Welch because he brought me closer to Christ. And I was like, this is unbelievable. Like the amount of people that can have bad blood against Jack Welch, and they're just like, God, I love him every single day. And
Well, I think he was being
I mean, yeah,
a
I
little
think he's like
ironic,
a
but
little ironic, but I mean,
yeah.
he's also a devout Presbyterian. It's not like that comes from nowhere, also,
Well, he went
like,
from being a hard-boiled, Thomas F. O'Boyle, from being a no pun intended, hard-boiled, investigative reporter for the Wall Street Journal covering GE to, finding God in
yeah,
Pennsylvania
yeah,
and
which is,
having no regrets, no doubts. He wrote this
y-
hard-hitting book about GE. Jack just, eviscerated him constantly, including getting a hold of his book proposal and then sicking, a former U.S. attorney on
which
him.
is like incredible. Like that is so wild. Like my
Mind
worst
blowing.
nightmare as a freelancer is anyone leaking an early draft of something I've done, let alone the proposal for a book or like doing stuff with that. It's just incredible. I mean, this guy's power was crazy, and I think part of how he rose there, if I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong, is what he saw possible with GE Capital once he became CEO,
Well,
right?
absolutely.
So can you tell that sort of explain what he did with GE in that way? Because to me, that's the huge part of the story, not just of Jack Welch, but then sort of what happens to Jeff Immelt once he gets handed the ball.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really underappreciated how important GE Capital was to GE, both by investors, by Wall Street research analysts who understood the industrial side of the business, but not the finance side of the business.
Mm,
I mean, it
mm.
started, of course, simply enough as a way for customers during the Depression to finance their purchases of GE appliances. Simple enough. But what Jack realized when he took over the running of it as he was sort of moving up the ladder before he became CEO, was that, and he said this to me, it was a lot easier to make money from money than it was to make money from bending metal into an aircraft engine. Um, and so he realized that there was this huge opportunity to arbitrage GE's AAA credit rating. GE was one of 12 AAA rated companies, which basically means that its cost of capital was extremely low, just above treasuries. And so, in other words, just above the rate that the US government could borrow. And so he was able to arbitrage that low cost of capital by borrowing in the short-term financing markets, the commercial paper markets, and then turning around and lending that money out for 7, 10, 15, 20 plus years at huge spreads, making a huge amount of money. And, as long as the commercial paper markets continued to function normally, which of course they did until 2008, everything was great. GE didn't need to own a bank, so GE didn't have any deposits, but it just had this huge opportunity to borrow short, lend long, borrow cheaply, and lend out inexpensively. And Jack just loved it. And he had, some great people like Gary Wendt and Dennis Naden who understood that business and managed the risks for Jack. And that's of course where I was working.
Mhm.
Uh, and so yeah, and not only financing the leveraged buyouts, as I said, but then working for the chief credit officer. So I really, even though it was whatever 1987 when I did that, and so this was, 23 3 or 13 plus another 20 or so years later, so 30 plus years later, what I had picked up from my year working for the chief credit officer became very valuable to me as I was writing the book, because I had a clear understanding of what GE Capital was all about. And in writing my other books about the fall of Bear Stearns
Mm.
in 2008, or how Goldman Sachs managed to avoid the fate of Bear Stearns, I learned intimately what happened during the financial crisis, and then of course GE got caught up in it without people realizing it. Everybody was focused on the Wall Street banks and
Yeah.
car companies.
See, I think, to me, so I've just while I was reading your book, I was finishing up a like 10,000 word piece on Enron's impact on America's energy industry, because I think that's an undertold part of the story. Everybody wants to talk about Arthur Andersen and all this, and of course it's sexy and it did have a huge impact, as you detail in your book. But I noticed something that was really similar in uh sort of like a transition in the 90s in companies like Enron or GE that were known as having being like asset heavy in certain ways, generating appliances or having these like hard deliverables, but then also adopted huge financial arms to them, right? Like Jeff Skilling's contribution to Enron is to almost turn it into like a finance company or something like that. And then once Enron falls, and this is around the time Jack Welch is handing off his crown to Jeff Immelt, it just sends these ripples through everything. First of all, huge doubt about the ability to be this sort of hybrid finance asset heavy thing. And that also invites a lot of scrutiny onto what people are doing with their books. And that impacts GE because GE Capital is sort of like this black box. There's this weird sort of dance that happens between Enron and all of these major investing companies and companies like GE. GE buys a bunch of their wind farms and stuff like that. But it really changes things for Jeff Immelt right out the gate. Like he says in your book, I had one good day when I started, and it was September 10th, 2001. And then he wakes up the next day and it's tragically 9/11. And I think people forget, like, GE has a huge turbine or had a huge turbine, and I don't know where they are now with that, but they were selling jet engine parts and things like that. Like, it was a
Well,
disaster. And
they
then
made the
two
jet
months
engines on those planes.
yeah, and then 2 months later, Enron stock drops to like 50 cents and they file for bankruptcy, and like that shockwave comes out. So Immelt can't inherit Jack's world, right? Like, sort of the way Jack had built it, the context around GE changed like immediately. I
Yeah.
was so amazed by that, because I think Jack really did everything he could to hand off the best GE he could possibly create.
Yeah, that's quite true. I mean, absolutely. And I think that's hugely important context. And that, is something that, of course, Jeff Immelt said to me and feels very strongly about. I mean, Jack told me that he felt like he handed Jeff off a royal flush. And I think,
Mm-hmm.
Jeff didn't see it that way. And of course, as you were saying, the macroeconomic environment that Jeff had to operate in was utterly changed from like a light switch from September 10th to September 11th. GE made the jet engines on the planes. GE had reinsured a number of the buildings down at the World Financial Center. GE owned NBC, which of course didn't have
Mm-hmm.
any advertising for a week or so, costing it hundreds of millions of dollars. And and then the fall of Enron, WorldCom, Adelphia, it just the passage of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act,
Mm-hmm.
where CEOs and CFOs had to sign off on their financial statements. Jack didn't have to do that. And so, the degrees of freedom, shall we say, that
Mm-hmm.
used to exist for Jack, no longer. And of course, Jack, was the beneficiary of this incredible bull market that went from 82 to 2001. And so, um, you know, the world changed. Now, Jeff cites that in his defense for why it was more difficult for him to manage and run GE. Jack's response to that as well. GE continued to run pretty well under Jeff for the next 7 years. It was only until the financial crisis in 2008 when things began to change. And it was really after in the first quarter of 2008 when Bear Stearns went down the tubes on March 15th, 2008. That was almost to the end of the first quarter of the year, and Jeff had basically said, GE was going to make, X amount of dollars if net income, and he missed that estimate by, whatever it is,
Hmm.
$1 billion or so.
First time that had
And,
happened since like 1938, right? To GE, like they had always delivered more or less, like
certainly
since
under
then.
Jack's leadership, the
Yeah.
20 years of Jack, he always delivered quarter after quarter after quarter, saying what he would. And this is the first time that, in a long time that the CEO of GE had said they were going to make whatever it was in the first quarter of 2008, but because of the tumult in the capital markets after Bear Stearns filed for bankruptcy, you know, Jeff Immelt couldn't do what Jack had been doing forever, which was sort of taking assets out of GE Capital and selling them as needed to make the numbers in a given quarter. And so he missed the mark by whatever it was, like $1 billion. And Jack just was infuriated by that. Actually went on CNBC, which of course Jack had started when he, after they bought NBC, and said that if Jeff ever think about this, the form,
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
not quite like it's not quite like Bob Iger coming back. I mean, at least he didn't come back. But if you think about, he goes on CNBC and he says if Jeff Immelt ever misses a quarter again, misses what he says he's going to do, I'm going to take out a gun and shoot him on national television to
It's
your
just
CEO.
it was to me like I couldn't believe what I was reading. I was like, this is out of control. Like this looks so bad because it doesn't just look bad for Emil because Jack is Teflon in a way, right? Like everybody's still gonna love Jack. People might be like, that's out of
Yeah.
line. It's not a good look for him, but they're all still gonna love him at the end of the day. But it makes GE look like to me that moment was a real portent for like what happens to Flannery later. To me, I was like, there's some love there. I was like, something has changed in like
Mm.
the natural order of things for this company
The
where
social compact, whatever the quiet
yeah,
agreement was, the
it was
whatever
over.
the rule about the Republicans, we don't criticize another Republican, whatever it is,
Yeah.
that Reagan always espoused and adhered to, and obviously is gone now.
Mhm.
That was sort of that same moment. We don't criticize a previous CEO, and despite that, I mean, Jeff told me how angry he was about that, but he still never criticized Jack, even though he didn't talk to Jack much after that. But that was definitely a turning point.
Yeah. So let's back up a little bit and talk about Immel and where he comes from and what his deal is. I found him to be a very tragic figure when I read the book. Like Jack seemed like allergic to losing in a way. Like he was just like almost constitutionally incapable for a really long time of that happening to him. And I was very interested in the fact that Jack comes from chemicals. He comes from like the hard physical world and then displays this adroitness when it comes to finance and all these other things. And Jeff, my understanding is that he's more of like a sales guy. And then his idea to save GE is to get out of GE Capital back into like the more asset sort of heavy making stuff, things. But the capabilities didn't seem to port the other way. They almost did for Jack. And some of that seemed to have to do with Immelt's constitution. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit more about this guy.
Sure. Well, he grew up in Cincinnati, one of two brothers. By the way, his older brother is senior partner at a major law firm based in Washington, or
Mhm.
was for a long time. So very accomplished family. His father was worked at GE jet engines for like 30 years
Mm.
in a facility, by the way, that was underground because of like national security concerns. So for 30 years, his father would go to work and work underground
Man.
every day, which is pretty interesting. Uh, his brother Steve was at Yale. Jeff decided he didn't want to go to Yale. He went to Dartmouth, played football, frat guy. Uh, then went to Harvard Business School, where he was, focused on marketing. His first job out of Harvard Business School was on the Duncan Hines account at P&G, and then moved on to GE. So and then was a lifer at GE. Worked through all sorts of different. Started in plastics too, but worked in all sorts of different businesses, including major appliances and the healthcare business, and then running GE in a famous, three-way bake-off that occurred, in 1999, 2000, that Jeff won, and he did not have, he seems very gregarious,
Mhm.
sort of like a big guy, hail fellow, well met, Midwest kind of thing. But I don't think
Yeah,
he
it's
had
almost
the same.
Falstaffian vibe to
But he didn't have the same gregariousness and connection. He didn't make the same connections with people. He didn't
Mm.
inspire the same kind of loyalty. Uh, you know, I think loyalty is a two-way street. Like Jack gave loyalty and he got loyalty.
Mhm.
Uh, uh, Jeff, people would probably give Jeff their loyalty, but he didn't really return it uh, in the same way Jack did. So if you didn't agree with Jack, he had plenty of time for that. He could change his mind. He didn't get upset about that. He realized it was like a big tent, and we have to, allow for many different points of view to be expressed, and even dissenting views had to be accommodated. And I'd be willing to change my mind,
Mm.
even
Mm.
though I went into the meeting not agreeing with you at all. But kudos to you. You changed my way of thinking, and I'm big enough to accommodate that. Jeff, unfortunately, he would say to me repeatedly how he believed that he kept the best people around him, but I didn't really find a whole lot of evidence of that. What I found instead is that if people disagreed with him, they left soon thereafter.
Mm.
And so I think
Yeah,
he
and it
lost
happens over and over again in the
loyalty.
book.
Happened over and over again. And I wasn't just, being selective. I wasn't being mean spirited. I was just being reportorial. I
Mhm.
mean, when you lose, Dave Calhoun, if you lose now the CEO of Boeing, or if you lose Michael Prawley, who had, you know, um, made the real estate business at G Capital huge, or John Krenicki, who's now at Clayton Dubilier, who was running the power business, you know, you've got to be able to. It was interesting because Jack, like I was telling you the story of Dave Cody. I mean, he basically said, "All right, Dave, you're not going to be CEO. You got to go." Even the two candidates that did not succeed in becoming the CEO after Jack, Jim McNerney and Robert Nardelli, Jack basically said, "You guys got to leave." Which, I get that on one level. You don't want the runners up hanging around,
Mhm.
second guessing what you're doing as the new CEO. So I get that. And on the other hand, that's a lot of talent to lose. I mean, Nardelli went
Of
on to be CEO of Home Depot and Chrysler, and
Mhm.
and McNerney to be the CEO of Boeing. So that's a lot of talent to walk out the door. But but Jack was very clear about that. People would leave under Jeff, and I don't think he really wanted them to leave, but he in the sense that he wanted them to stay, but he didn't like being disagreed with. And
Mhm. Mhm.
people felt like, okay, now I've done it. I've stepped on the roadside device. by disagreeing with him, and now I've blown myself up with, the CEO, and I gotta leave.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it seemed to me like Jack expected loyalty and gave loyalty. Immelt expected fealty, which was very different in its like
Very
social
different.
complexion, you
Yeah,
know, and he seemed to not be aware of that, which to me is really a kiss of death,
yeah.
like
He did not
because
have
if
great EQ,
yeah, so if
surprisingly.
yeah, if you're creating relationships with people as a leader and you are unaware of the way in which like you're just self-deceived about the way in which you're molding them, it's going to be very difficult for you as time goes on because those create dynamics that perpetuate and also roll downward, like the fish rots from the head. And that there were so many times where I really felt for Immelt because I thought he got dealt a really rough hand, you know? Um, and
Well,
I
I don't know. He got dealt a pretty great hand. He took over a company that was the most valuable and most respected in the world.
Sure, and like I'm not going to deny that, but we've talked about the macroeconomic thing, and I felt bad for him, like almost the way you feel for a tragic character, or
Right.
like Oedipus, where you say, if only you could see
Yes.
the thing that you can't see, this would be very different.
And of course it's such a typically human trait. In fact,
Yeah.
the exception is the person like Jack, who has a lot of self-awareness,
Hmm. Oh
is
yeah,
self-deprecating,
yeah. It
as well as
also.
tough and, cruel and impolitic. And Jack probably would have been canceled, if you were around today.
Oh, are you kidding? Yeah, of course. I
He'd
mean,
be
this is
he'd be fodder for the canceling mill.
yeah. I mean, this is sort of what I found so profound about your book, right? Because I was thinking about it, and I'd read it right after reading Catherine Blunt's history of Pacific Gas and Electric. And I was like, these are both rise and fall stories. And the rise and
Hmm.
fall is very different for both. There's
Very
like
different.
these structural, almost archival problems that like PG&E really runs into, especially with their transmission wires, all of these things that has to do with being also a 3 century company. For GE, there's almost this like Roman problem, this Machiavellian problem that if you read any of the ancient political philosophers, they're always concerned with this because they're all aristocrats, and it's the succession problem. And that endures as a really difficult thing to pull off. Who succeeds who and how do they maintain what's been built? And that problem has not gone away.
No, no, and again, it goes to the heart of human nature. Like look at Disney and Bob
Mm,
Iger, right? He wanted to. He probably hated the idea of like having to give up being CEO of Disney, right? He did it kind of only reluctantly. And who does he choose to succeed him? A guy who he probably suspected was going to fail. And like this
sure.
whole thing he didn't want to choose anybody that would outshine him. Look at what's
Hmm.
happening, at JP Morgan Chase with Jamie Dimon. All the potential heirs to the throne, they just get tired of waiting. The guy will not give up the post. I'm not
Hmm.
saying he should, because he's obviously quite talented, but I mean, what he's depleting his succession ranks. Jack actually, cultivated an extraordinary group of potential successors,
Yes.
and to his credit, now he says he picked the wrong one, which is a major blunder, right? Which he admits to me even before I could sit down at the table in Nantucket Country Club. Okay, he says that, and it sort of blows my mind. But at least he, created a very public succession process, and nobody disputed the talents of the
Hmm.
three people who were in succession race, and there could have even have been others, as we talked about Dave Cody. Meanwhile, Jeff didn't do that at all. He just, partially because he didn't think he was going to get abruptly fired when he did. He thought he had more time, but nevertheless,
Not that much more time though. It was three
well, so he
years.
says.
Yeah.
Well, so he was abruptly fired in June of 2017. He said he was already planning to leave at the end of that year. In truth, he hoped to be there as long as Jack, which was 20 years. So he had 3 more years to go, and I'm sure they had to very quickly gin up a succession plan, which benefited my friend John Flannery. So I was thinking, this is great. Finally, one of the good guys, really one
Mhm.
of the really good guys, has made it to the top of one of these organizations. How unlikely is that? Right? That never happens. Right? How often is it a good guy that gets to the top, or girl or lady?
Mhm. Sure.
Very rarely. So, and then of course, what happened? He gets zotzed. So at that point, I'm thinking, Jesus, I got to figure out what happened here. So, which again gets back to
Yeah, so tell me that story a little bit. Like, tell me about the handout. We sort of talked about like from Jack to Jeff. Tell me a little bit about what happened. Like, it's to me, it was like it was some real like like skullduggery. Lots of stuff is happening in the background, when it comes to Flannery and the handoff there. So what's going on?
well, the first, GE has to get, it goes back to the 2008 financial crisis, which
Hmm.
again, nobody focused on because everybody was focused on what was going on Wall Street and the TARP and all the lines of credit that the Treasury and the FDIC were making available and the Fed were making
Hmm.
available to all these financial institutions. And people were focused on the Wall Street banks. Are they going to go down the tubes? Or the car companies, are they going to go down the tubes? Or AIG, is it going to go down the tubes? Nobody was focusing on GE. Now, GE had like the fourth largest financial institution in the country underneath its banner. And so I didn't even realize, I mean, I knew how big GE Capital was, but I didn't realize that Jeff Immelt had to go hat in hand to Hank Paulson and then hat in hand to Sheila Bair at the FDIC and had to beg to get into these lines of financing to make it possible for them to continue to do business, and that GE Capital had almost filed for bankruptcy twice
Hmm.
during 2008 and 2009. So that was a stunning revelation. And so then GE Capital, they get the bailout, which nobody really focuses on. They get bailed out. They get access to all these lines of credit, because the sources of financing that they had been using, the commercial paper market, obviously got disrupted in September of 2008. And so they became a SIFI. They became a systemically important financial institution, which meant that they went from being unregulated to being heavily regulated by the Fed. And that cost GE, $2 billion plus a year. And the Fed was all over almost every decision that GE was making, including attending board meetings and just sort of being a general nuisance, or so Jeff Immelt thought. So then he makes the big decision to get out of GE Capital so that they would no longer be a SIFI. So he makes that decision in 2015. They package it all up. They make a big announcement. They call it Project Hubble. And, he's got all these plans, what he's going to do for the money. Of course, by announcing that you're going to sell GE Capital, of course, everybody, on Wall Street who's a potential buyer is going to pick your pocket because you're
Sure.
a
Yeah.
declared seller. So
Yeah.
that wasn't the greatest strategy. But then he compounds it by essentially inviting Tryon Partners, Nelson Peltz's hedge fund, activist hedge fund, to buy into the GE equity and to essentially ratify Jeff's brilliance by endorsing, saying, okay, Nelson Peltz is now spending $2.5 billion to buy a tiny stake in GE's equity and ratifying Jeff's brilliance of selling GE Capital and redeploying the capital, buying back stock, et cetera, et cetera. And so that turned out to be a disastrous decision.
Hmm.
And essentially, what he hoped would be a friendly activist investor. It's almost the words don't even go together. A friendly activist investor. But he thought that they would be friendly because he had been friendly with Nelson Peltz's son-in-law, Ed Garden's brother, at Dartmouth, and used to go to the Garden's house in Melrose, Massachusetts on holidays instead of going back to Cincinnati. So he thought they would be friendly, but in fact, they weren't. And 2 years later, as Jeff, you know, the stock was going down and he had wasted 30 billion of capital buying back the stock at $40+ a share to reduce the denominator in the shares outstanding so that he could hope to make $2 a share in 2018, and it was clear that he wasn't going to, but he refused to give up the ghost on $2 a share. And
Mm.
anyway, it all came to a head at a meeting with Wall Street analysts in Longboat Key, Florida in May of 2017, and then he was fired by his friend Nelson Peltz, who he called the smiling crocodile, in June of 2017. And very quickly, they could tell that his days were numbered. They ginned up a succession process
Hmm.
between John Flannery and a couple of, Steve Bowles, who was head of the power division, but of course he never really had a chance, and Jeff Bornstein, who was the CFO. I mean, again, I think John Flannery was the right choice, but very quickly, problems that he did not know about were uncovered. Problems in the power business in terms of, selling power plants to like the country of Angola and
Yeah.
essentially financing that acquisition, and then they don't pay their bills,
It,
factoring the receiveables.
it reminded me of the Rebecca Marks like Bhopal deal in India for that big power plant that never got made. Like all of these things, that if they stay on your books long enough, like they will come back to haunt you.
Yeah, essentially they were mortgaging their future to
Yeah.
try to make this elusive $2 a share that Jeff had promised. And people were telling him you're never going to make $2 a share. He wouldn't refuse to budget off that. And of course, that he died. He was hoisted on the $2 a share
Hmm.
petard. That was his cross of gold. And so, John felt he had to come clean with what was going on in the power business, which was a disaster. And then there was the whole long-term health liability that Jeff could have gotten rid of when he got rid of the other insurance businesses, but failed to do that. And that became like a $15 billion surprise liability, which actually, this was pre-COVID. They had to announce that. I think actually COVID, because essentially people were living longer
Hmm.
than the actuaries had anticipated, and so the liabilities related to their longer lives were coming back to haunt GE, who still owned these businesses. So they had to put up a $15 billion liability, against it, a capital allocation against the liability, and surprising the markets, the stock tanks. Ironically, COVID, a lot of these people they were insuring were in nursing homes, who were
Hmm.
living longer, but in COVID, of course, many of them could not survive that, and so probably the liability has shrunk. But in any event, so John is revealing these things, in one problem after the other, and by then he had invited Ed Garden from Trian Partners onto the board. He had invited Larry Culp, who used to be at Danaher,
Hmm.
onto the board, to try to get their wisdom, and they just teamed up together to defenestrate
Yes.
John
Yeah.
after 15 months.
They gave him his
Totally
walking
unfair,
papers.
totally outrageous, but
I thought so too. When I was reading it, I thought this was I mean, it was just incredible. I grew up with GE my whole life. I think that that's something,
yeah, we all did.
yeah, we all did. I mean, I think, and that's changing now. There's some interesting things that ripple through the power division and the utility side of the business, that for good reason don't appear here. But it was something that if you read like old trade publications, everybody's worried about the fact that they're not getting the cream of the crop engineers in the same way that they used to. And this problem begins in the 50s. And like,
Hmm.
so long lead time on that. And you can still see the op-eds in like electrical world in the 80s being like, they're all
Hmm.
going to Silicon Valley. And you mention it, and I think that this is really important, the cutting edge appliances that start to change everyday life start coming out of Silicon Valley. and are no longer coming out of GE. And that feels like a real changing of the guard too. Um, I think, especially for people my generation or younger, it's hard to appreciate the way in which these conglomerates repatterned American life with their output, their consumer output, the way
Yeah,
our
I
consumer
think
culture was made.
people, it, GE was a technological leader in the same
Yeah.
way we may think of today, whatever, Google or Microsoft or Oracle or Apple or whatever, Tesla, whatever, being a technological leader.
Hmm.
GE was all of that and more. I mean, the creation of electricity, the
Yeah.
X-ray machines, the jet engine, perfecting jet engines. Still, they make the best jet engines in the
Yeah. They
world.
were there at the dawn of the atomic age, like they were doing all of it.
All of it.
Yeah. So to wrap up, this was fantastic, by the way. I really appreciate you coming on. I've been spoiling to talk about this book since I finished it because my wife can only hear so much about
Yeah,
General
my wife feels
Electric.
the same way.
Yeah. um, I know that you've got some other stuff going on, I think. So I wanted to give you a chance to tell our audience where they can find your work as it comes out. Obviously, guys, buy the book. It's in the show notes. Go buy it. But yeah,
Well, I mean, I had a pretty interesting career. First as a journalist, then as a banker. Now going back to writing books and being a journalist. I was a special correspondent at Vanity Fair for 13 years. Wrote stories, profiles of all sorts of Hollywood, business, you name it, people. I've written 7 books, uh, everything from a book about Lazard, where I worked, Bear Stearns, the collapse of Bear Stearns, history of Goldman Sachs, to the Duke lacrosse scandal, to a book called Four Friends about 4 of my friends from high school and what happened to them in their lives, the GE book. And I started one of the founding partners of something called Puck, which is a new digital news commentary and analysis site, an organization. We've got 10 or so writers. We've got venture capital backing. I think it's having big and great impact. And I write for all sorts of publications, from the FT to the New York Times to Town and Country. I have a cover story coming out, Town and Country, on Brian Cox, the actor who's the lead in Succession, which is beginning its 4th season next month. So, I have a website, williamcohan.com, where you can find all of my books and many of the articles I've written over the last 19 years.
fantastic. Well, everybody, all of that stuff again will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me, man. Everybody else, stay sharp, stay strong, and stay radiant. We will see you next time.